The Concordance of Sentient Worlds called it the Great Correction, a term as sterile and placid as the beings who conceived it. It was never a war, not in the vulgar sense of shattered hulls and irradiated planets. Humanity was not conquered, it was audited. Our ledgers were found wanting, our expansionist ambitions marked as a liability against the galactic standard of tranquil stagnation. The correction was a series of meticulously crafted sanctions, trade embargoes, and technological blockades. A slow, systemic poisoning of our prospects. They didn't need fleets to break us. They used tariffs. They didn't need soldiers. They used regulations. One by one, our colony charters were revoked, our shipping lanes throttled, our nascent terraforming projects deemed ecologically unsound by a committee of beings who breathed methane and saw our desperate need for oxygen as a form of aggression. Earth and its children were relegated to the galactic slums, scattered across a dozen marginally habitable systems in the Orion Spur, a cosmic ghetto where our dreams were left to suffocate in thin atmospheres and thinner hopes. We became an afterthought, a cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of the Concordance capital on Xylos. The loud, ambitious apes who reached for the stars and had their hands slapped for their impertinence. For a century, we bled quietly. We learned to live with the rust, the hunger, the patronizing gaze of our galactic superiors. We scavenged. We bartered. We forgot the taste of sovereignty. Humanity was a ghost haunting its own ruins, a species whose brightest future was a managed decline into obscurity. The galaxy did not hate us. It simply did not think of us at all. That was their gravest mistake. The first sign that something had changed did not come with a bang, but with a hum. It was a sound that did not travel through the air, for it began in the void, a subquantum resonance that tickled the most sensitive instruments of the Vex, a gaseous species whose entire existence was a symphony of gravitational waves and cosmic frequencies. On the listening post orbiting Cygnus X1, Vexian astrometrics chanters noted an anomaly, a signal that was not a signal. It had no origin point, no waveform, no velocity. It simply was. It existed simultaneously across an entire sector, a faint, discordant note in the silent music of space-time. They logged it as a sensor ghost, a statistical improbability born of the nearby singularity, and thought no more of it. They were wrong. The target was the Zenith Citadel, a breathtaking orbital construct that served as the primary nexus for the inter-system financial markets. It was owned and operated by the Cathar, a species of silicon-based life forms renowned for their cold, unflinching logic and their instrumental role in designing the economic models that had so efficiently dismantled human civilization. The Citadel was their masterpiece, a web of crystalline towers and shimmering energy conduits suspended in the Lagrange point between two gas giants, a monument to a galaxy governed by the merciless calculus of profit and loss. It was here that the final decrees strangling the last human freeholds had been ratified, not with malice, but with the detached indifference of an accountant closing a failed account. Cathar Administrator Zorl was reviewing quarterly yield projections when the Citadel's internal chronometers began to flicker. It was an impossibility. The station's timekeeping was synced to a dozen different pulsars, buffered by quantum processors that measured the decay of quarks. It was more reliable than the stars themselves. Yet, every display on its command deck was stuttering, the digits blurring, accelerating. A junior functionary reported that the station's outer hull was showing signs of micro-pitting, the kind of molecular decay one would expect after centuries of exposure to solar winds. The Citadel was less than 40 years old. Panic was an inefficient emotion, an illogical cascade of neurochemical responses the Cathar had long since engineered out of their consciousness. What Zarel felt was a severe cognitive dissonance. The data flooding its console was a direct contradiction of physical law. Hull integrity was dropping by a full percentage point every second. Structural supports were reporting metallic fatigue that should have taken millennia to develop. Through the vast viewport that overlooked the Citadel's main spire, Zorel watched as the crystalline tower, a structure designed to withstand a supernova, began to cloud. The flawless, translucent material turned opaque, then yellowed, crisscrossed with a million tiny fractures. It was aging. The entire 10-mile-long station was aging, dying of old age in the span of minutes. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no enemy fleet on their sensors. There was only the hum, which had now grown from a sub-quantum whisper into an audible, bone-jarring thrum that vibrated through the Citadel's very frame. The station did not have speakers in the conventional sense, but the hum resonated through every conductive surface, a sound that felt ancient and full of sorrow. Then came the music. From every communication node, every internal broadcast unit, every Cathar's personal data link, a melody began to play. It was a simple tune, a lullaby, sung by a human voice, a woman's. The recording was old, laced with static and the hiss of age. A ghost whisper carried on a wave of impossible energy. As the lullaby played, the Citadel's end accelerated. The spire crumbled, collapsing not in a fiery explosion, but in a silent cascade of glittering dust, like a rotted tree finally surrendering to gravity. Power conduits flickered and died. Life support systems failed. Their machinery corroded into relics. The thousands of Cathar and other beings aboard were not harmed directly. The phenomenon seemed to affect only inorganic matter. One moment they were standing on a solid deck. The next they were floating in the cold vacuum, surrounded by the particulate remains of their monument to commerce. They were witnesses, left alive to testify. The lullaby played on for 3 full minutes after the Zenith Citadel had been reduced to a shimmering cloud of ancient dust. Then it faded, and the hum was gone. In the Concordant Security Council chambers on Xylos, emergency was an understatement. Holographic effigies of the galaxy's most powerful leaders flickered into existence, their faces a mixture of disbelief and a nascent, primal fear. The Vexian ambassador, a shimmering column of coherent gas, swirled with agitation. Our deep-range sensors detected nothing. It pulsed. No warp signature, no energy weapon discharge, just a localized quantum resonance. And then, nothing. The Cathar representative, its crystalline form radiating cold fury, was stark. The Zenith Citadel is gone, erased, aged into oblivion. We have 17,000 survivors in escape pods, and none can explain what they saw. They speak of a song, a human song. The words fell into the chamber like stones, creating a silence that was louder than any alarm. Human. The word itself was an anachronism, a name for a problem that had been solved, a species that had been filed away and forgotten, a delegate from the Glypton hegemony, a being of polished obsidian, scoffed, its voice like grinding stones. That is impossible. The humans lacked the technology to project a paper lantern, let alone a weapon that violates causality. Their most advanced warship would be a museum piece in any of our fleets. This must be the work of a rival power, using the humans as a scapegoat. But the fear was contagious. On a grimy freighter drifting through the asteroid fields of the Karen Belt, a human salvager named Kalen listened to the news feeds with a grim smile. The official Concordance broadcasts were a mess of confused reports and sanitized speculation. But the black market channels, the pirate streams, they were alive with the raw, unfiltered terror of the survivors. They played the recording of the lullaby, captured by a drifting boy. Kalen knew the song. It was an old Earth tune, one his grandmother used to sing to him, a song about a fallen star. He looked out at the star-dusted blackness, at the hulks of dead ships he picked apart for a living. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel like a scavenger. He felt like an inheritor. He did not know how it was done, or by whom, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had spent a century teaching humanity how to die quietly. Now, it seemed, they were about to be given a lesson in what it meant to be haunted. The Concordance dispatched its finest investigative fleet, the first Sentinels, to the site of the Citadel's demise. They found nothing but a debris field of preternaturally old matter and a lingering temporal echo that their scientists could not explain. They searched for a ship, for a weapon, for any tangible evidence of an aggressor. They found only a ghost. And across the scattered, broken colonies of humanity, a forbidden hope began to stir. They had been silenced, but their grief had been given a voice, and it was singing. The song was a promise, a declaration whispered from the grave of a forgotten people. We are still here, and you will remember us. The second blow fell 2 weeks later. In the interim, the Concordance of Sentient Worlds had done what all vast, sclerotic bureaucracies do in the face of an existential threat. It formed committees. Task forces were assembled, intelligence networks triple-checked, and fleets were mobilized with a ponderous, self-important urgency. The prevailing theory, championed by the still furious Cathar and the ever-arrogant Glypton hegemony, was that a rival power, perhaps the isolationist machine minds of the Cygnian Arm or the enigmatic ascendants of the Galactic Core, had developed a new form of temporal weapon. The human connection, the lullaby, was dismissed as a sophisticated misdirection, a psychological flourish designed to sow chaos. The idea that a broken, destitute species could be responsible was not just improbable, it was insulting. Prefect Valerius of the Xylosian Guard, a being whose long, avian features were set in a permanent expression of weary competence, was tasked with leading the investigation. Valerius was a pragmatist. While his superiors debated grand strategy and pointed holographic fingers at ancient rivals, he took a small, fast frigate to the only place that felt relevant, the forgotten territories of the human diaspora. He saw firsthand what the correction had wrought. He toured hollowed-out asteroid mines where humans still worked with equipment centuries out of date. Their bodies stooped, their eyes holding a particular kind of lusterless resignation. He visited orbital habitats where the air was thin and the light was recycled, and the only exports were scrap metal and quiet despair. He found no evidence of advanced weaponry, no secret shipyards, no hint of a technological renaissance. All he found was poverty, a deep and abiding exhaustion, and a strange, unsettling silence when he mentioned the Zenith Citadel. They knew they would not speak of it, but in the flicker of their eyes, in the tightening of their mouths, he saw a shared, secret knowledge. It was not the pride of a victorious people, but the grim satisfaction of the long-abused seeing their tormentor finally stumble. It made the fine hairs on his neck frill stand on end. He was looking for a weapon, but he was beginning to suspect he should be looking for a motive. Meanwhile, in the Karen Belt, Kalen was chasing a ghost. His ship's deep scan sensors had picked up a faint, anomalous energy signature emanating from the wreck of the Odyssey, an old Earth science vessel that had been blasted apart during the initial enforcement of the Concordance blockades a century ago. It was a well-picked carcass, but the signature was new, a whisper of power from deep within its shattered spine. Donning his EVA suit, Kalen made his way through the twisted, frozen corridors of the derelict. The ship was a time capsule of a more hopeful era. Faded posters on the walls depicted verdant, terraformed worlds that were never settled. Data terminals, long dead, were labeled with ambitious project names: stellar cartography, exogenetics, quantum resonance theory. It was this last one that drew him in. In the ruins of the main laboratory, pinned beneath a warped bulkhead, was a small, hexagonal object made of a matte black material that seemed to drink the light from his helmet lamp. It was a data core, but unlike any he had ever seen. There were no ports, no seams, no visible interface. It was a perfect, inert solid. As his gloved fingers brushed against its surface, he felt it a vibration, infinitesimally small, that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest. It was the hum, faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. He worked for hours to free the object, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating reverence. He felt like an archaeologist unearthing a sacred relic. When he finally brought it aboard his ship, the Rust Dog, the core was silent. He scanned it, X-rayed it, bombarded it with every diagnostic tool he had. It was a black box, its internal structure impossibly dense, its composition unknown. It was a piece of the mystery, and it was his. The Concordance's second mistake was believing the next attack would be military. They fortified their shipyards, patrolled their trade routes, and aimed their sensors at the heavens, waiting for a fleet that would never come. The target this time was not a symbol of wealth, but of knowledge. The great luminarium of Glyptus the First was the memory of the galaxy, carved into the heart of a tidally locked moon. The luminarium was a planetary-scale archive. Its crystalline walls, miles deep, were inscribed with the complete histories of every species in the Concordance. Its data vaults held trillions of yottabytes of art, science, philosophy, and law. The Glyptons, a species whose identity was inextricably linked to their perfect, eidetic memories and their role as galactic archivists, considered the luminarium to be their collective soul. It was a monument to permanence, to the belief that what is known can never be lost. Chief Archivist Zal, a towering figure of polished, obsidian-like stone, was overseeing the final inscription of the Cathar economic theorems, the very ones used to justify the correction when the light in the central chamber began to fail. It did not flicker, it receded, as if the concept of luminosity itself was being unraveled. The soft, internal glow of the archive's crystal walls dimmed to a murky twilight, and then the hum returned. Stronger this time, a resonant chord that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the moon. It was accompanied by a new sound, broadcast from every vox point in the archive. It was not a lullaby. It was a complex, mathematical piece of music, a piano fugue of such intricate and layered beauty that it felt more like an equation than a melody. As the music swelled, a junior archivist let out a cry of grinding stone, a sound of pure terror. He was pointing at the Great Wall of Beginnings, where the origin story of the Glypton people was inscribed in characters of light. The characters were vanishing. They were not being erased or overwritten. They were simply fading, one by one, into blank. Sterile crystal. Zal rushed to a data terminal, his massive form moving with surprising speed. He tried to access the core vaults to secure the primary records. The console before him was blank. He could not remember the access protocols. He could not remember his own designation. He looked at his multi-jointed hands, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he could not remember what they were for. The phenomenon swept through the luminarium like an invisible fire, but it did not burn. It erased. Data slates turned to smooth, featureless rectangles. Inscribed histories faded from the walls. The complex neural pathways that formed the Glypton's perfect memories began to smooth over. The carefully stored information bleeding away into nothingness. They did not die. They were hollowed out. They became beautiful, intricate statues of obsidian. Their minds wiped clean. Their entire cultural history, their very sense of self, gone. A species defined by what it knew was now defined by what it had forgotten. The attack was surgical, precise, and absolute. When a rescue team finally arrived, they found tens of thousands of Glyptons wandering aimlessly through the now silent halls of the luminarium, their eyes vacant, their movements purposeless. The archives of the galaxy, the memory of 1,000 civilizations, were blank. Aboard the Rust Dog, Kalen was thrown from his chair as the black data core on his workbench flared to life. The hum that filled his small cabin was deafening. The piano fugue so loud and clear it felt like the instrument was being played right next to him. The core levitated an inch off the table, and a pale blue light projected from its surface, splashing across the opposite bulkhead. It was not a clear image, but a chaotic swirl of data fragments. He saw star charts of unknown systems, complex equations that spiraled into infinity, and flickering, ghostly images of human faces, men and women in old-fashioned lab coats, their expressions intense, focused. They were working on something, gesturing at diagrams he couldn't understand. And through it all, he saw a recurring symbol, a circle with a single, horizontal line bisecting it, like a stylized representation of a closed eye. The projection lasted for the exact duration of the piano piece. And then, as the final note faded into silence, the core dropped back onto the table, once again inert, cold, and silent. Kalen sat on the floor, breathing heavily, his mind reeling. This was not a weapon in the way he understood it. This was something else. Vengeance, yes, but of a kind so profound and terrible it bordered on the divine. The first attack had destroyed the galaxy's wallet. The second had destroyed its mind. He looked at the black object on his table. He was no longer a salvager. He was the keeper of a key, the witness to a haunting. The humans had been erased from the galactic record, their history deemed irrelevant. Now, something born of that erasure was returning the favor, not with bombs, but with silence. and Kalen was somehow at the epicenter, a lonely man on a rusted ship, holding a piece of a ghost that was systematically unwriting the universe. The question was no longer who was doing this, but what would they target next? What other pillar of the Concordance's smug, self-assured reality was about to be turned to dust, or worse, into a forgotten dream? The amnesia of the Glyptons sent a new kind of terror through the Concordance. The loss of the Zenith Citadel had been an attack on their wealth, an act of cosmic vandalism. The scouring of the Great Luminarium was an assault on their very identity. A civilization is a shared story, a collection of memories. Without them, the Glyptons were reduced to a biological curiosity. The Concordance Security Council convened again, the holographic figures of its members radiating an energy that had curdled from arrogance to raw, undiluted fear. The human connection could no longer be dismissed as a misdirection. The lullaby, the fugue, these were the calling cards of a ghost that was not only real, but was also a connoisseur of poetic justice. Prefect Valerius's reports from the human territories were now read with a chilling new attention, his descriptions of a people steeped in a century of quiet resentment. Their culture preserved not in grand archives, but in whispered stories and scavenged data chips, painted a grim picture. He had been looking for a fleet and found a memory. Now, it seemed that memory had become a weapon. This is a war of narrative. The Vexian ambassador pulsed, its gaseous form swirling in agitated patterns. They are not destroying our assets. They are dismantling our reality. They took our commerce, then our history. What is the third pillar of our society? The Cathar delegate, its voice a low thrum of barely controlled logic, answered without hesitation, law. The Concordance Accords, the very framework of order that has governed this quadrant for a millennium. The implication hung in the silent chamber. The next target would be the Hall of Edicts on Xylos, the heart of the Concordance itself, the place where the accords were signed, stored, and adjudicated. It was a prospect so horrifying it was almost unthinkable. To strike at the hall was to strike at the concept of galactic civilization itself. Xylos was the most heavily defended planet in the known galaxy. An armada of the Concordance's finest ships formed a permanent shield in its orbit. Planetary defenses, powered by miniature black holes, could atomize an entire fleet in seconds. The planet was a fortress, and the Hall of Edicts was its sanctum sanctorum. They believed it to be impregnable. On board the Rust Dog, Kalen was becoming less of a salvager and more of an obsessive cryptographer. The Black Data Core had become the center of his universe. He had jury-rigged a containment field around it, powered by his ship's main reactor, hoping to coax another response. He replayed the recording of the Glypton fugue. He broadcast human radio signals from a century ago. He even sang the lullaby himself, his rough voice a pale imitation of the ghostly original. The core remained silent. It was waiting. He spent his time poring over the fragmented images he had recorded during its brief activation. The faces of the human scientists haunted him. They were not angry or vengeful. They were focused. Like architects drawing up a blueprint for a new and terrible kind of creation. And, always, there was the symbol, the circle bisected by a horizontal line. The closed eye. He cross-referenced it against every database he could access, from official Earth historical records to the darkest corners of the pirate datanet. He found nothing. It was a symbol with no history, a sigil for a secret that had been perfectly kept. Driven by a hunch he couldn't explain, He began to analyze the wreckage logs of the Odyssey, the ship where he'd found the core. The vessel had been on a deep space science mission, studying quantum resonance. The official report said it was destroyed by a concordance patrol for violating a blockade. But the ship's final, garbled sensor readings, buried under layers of corrupted data, told a different story. The Odyssey hadn't been destroyed by plasma cannons or torpedoes. It had been hit by a wave of impossibly high-energy particles that had caused its reactor to overload. The particle signature was unique, unidentifiable. The ship hadn't been a casualty of the correction. It had been the site of an experiment gone catastrophically wrong. Or, Kalen began to suspect, catastrophically right. The scientists in the projection hadn't just been studying quantum resonance. They had been weaponizing it. And the Odyssey had been their laboratory, their tomb, and perhaps their cocoon. The attack on Xylos did not begin with a hum. It began with a whisper in the dreams of every sentient being on the planet. For 3 nights, the sleep of the Xylosian elite was troubled. They dreamt of empty courtrooms and silent libraries. They dreamt of laws written in a language they could no longer read. They dreamt of a single, closed eye staring at them from a void of perfect blackness. They dismissed it as mass anxiety, the psychological fallout from the Glipton tragedy. On the 4th day, the laws began to disappear. It started in the lower courts. A judge, in the middle of passing sentence, found that he could no longer recall the specific article of the Concordance Accords he was citing. The text on his data slate had dissolved into a meaningless string of characters. A lawyer, arguing a complex case of interplanetary trade, suddenly forgot the principles of contract law. Standing mute and bewildered before the court, the chaos spread upwards, like a contagion of forgetting. Bureaucrats found themselves staring at forms they no longer understood. Security officers forgot the protocols for their own checkpoints. The intricate, interlocking system of rules and regulations that held Xylosian society together was unraveling, not from an external attack, but from within. Prefect Valerius stood in the central chamber of the Hall of Edicts, a vast, amphitheater-like space where the original Concordance Accords were displayed, their text etched into shimmering fields of contained energy. He watched in horror as the fields began to flicker and die. The elegant, complex script that had been the foundation of galactic peace for 1,000 years was vanishing. Letter by letter, there was no enemy fleet. The orbital defenses were silent, their sensors blank. The fortress was not being stormed. It was being hollowed out from the inside. Then, from the grand dome above the chamber, the music began. It was not a lullaby or a fugue. It was a choir. 1,000 human voices, men and women, young and old, singing in a language no one present understood, but in a tone that was universally recognizable, a dirge, a song of mourning for the dead. As the mournful chorus filled the hall, the final words of the accordees faded away, leaving the energy fields as blank and empty as the memories of the Gliptons. The foundation of galactic law was gone. Xylos did not fall into immediate anarchy. It fell into something far worse, a state of profound, systemic confusion. Without the Accords, there was no authority, no procedure, no basis for action. The military could not act without legal sanction. The government could not govern without regulations. The fortress had not been breached, but its operating system had been deleted. Aboard the Rust Dog, the data core was no longer projecting images, but sound. Kalen listened, mesmerized, as the dirge filled his cabin. He recognized the language. It was Latin, an ancient Earth language he had only read about in historical texts. He ran the lyrics through a translation program. The words were from an old Requiem Mass. Dies irae, dies illa, solvet seclum in favilla, a day of wrath. That day, the world will dissolve into ashes. The core was not just a weapons guidance system. It was a hymnal. It was a memorial. Each attack was a verse in a grand, terrible poem of retribution. The lullaby for the stolen future of their children. The fugue for the stolen knowledge of their minds. The requiem for the stolen justice of their laws. He finally understood. The scientists on the Odyssey had not built a doomsday device. They had created an echo, a quantum ghost forged from the collective grief and the memory of a dying species. They had tied it to the very fabric of space-time and given it a terrible, singular purpose to make the galaxy feel what humanity had felt, to be forgotten, to be silenced, to be erased. As the last notes of the Requiem faded, the data core projected a new image onto his bulkhead. It was not a memory of the past, but a target for the future. It was a star chart, and at its center was a single, unremarkable yellow star. Kalen's blood ran cold. He knew that star. Every human did. It was Sul, the cradle of their species. The ghost was going home. The panic on Xylos was absolute. The Concordance was headless, its laws erased, its history forgotten. Member worlds began to seal their borders, their ancient alliances dissolving in a wave of paranoia. The Cathar, ever logical, calculated that their best chance of survival was to sever all ties with the crumbling galactic order. The Vex retreated into their nebulae, their symphony of communication replaced by a fearful silence. The galaxy was balkanizing, devolving into a collection of terrified, isolated systems. Prefect Valerius, one of the few officials whose mind remained clear, saw the terrifying endgame. The weapon was not just destroying the Concordance, it was creating a power vacuum. And into that vacuum, what would rush anarchy anew? More ruthless empire? Or something else he finally understood, the human silence in the outer territories. They were not just watching their oppressor fall. They were waiting. The ghost was not just an instrument of revenge. It was a herald. It was clearing the stage. But for what? Or for whom? Kalen stared at the image of the Sol system. The closed eye was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a key. It had been forged in the death of the Odyssey, a ship that had died trying to escape the Concordance's grip. Perhaps it was not just returning home to deliver a final, devastating blow. Perhaps it was returning to unlock something that had been hidden there for a century. A last, desperate contingency left behind by a species that had refused to go quietly into the long night. He had to warn them. He had to warn Earth. But who would listen to a lone salvager in a rusted-out freighter? And how do you warn a world that a ghost, born of their own sorrow, was coming to tear down the very stars that had once been their birthright? He looked at the silent, black core on his table. He was no longer a witness. He was a messenger. And he was running out of time. News of the Concordance's collapse spread through the human territories, not like a wildfire, but like a rising tide. For a century, they had lived in the shadow of a mountain, and now the mountain had crumbled into dust. There was no grand celebration, no triumphant uprising. The response was a slow, collective exhale of breath that had been held for generations. On desolate mining colonies and in overcrowded orbital slums, the first reaction was disbelief, followed by a cautious, fragile hope. But beneath that hope was a deep, unsettling fear. The ghost that had dismantled their oppressors was born of their own pain. But it was not their servant. It was an elemental force, a quantum storm of grief that had been unleashed upon the galaxy, and no one knew where it would strike next. The projection of the Sol system on the bulkhead of the Rust Dog was a chilling omen. Kalen knew he had to act. He had the only tangible link to the phenomenon, the black data core that served as its resonant anchor and, perhaps, its conscience. He plotted a course for Earth, pushing his aging freighter's reactor to its absolute limit. The journey would take weeks, a desperate race against a phantom that moved outside the known laws of physics. He broadcast a message on a tight beam frequency, aimed at the United Earth Directorate, the shell of a government that still presided over the Sol system. He encoded it with old, pre-correction military ciphers, hoping to bypass the automated systems that would dismiss a salvager's hail. He identified himself, described the data core, and warned them of the incoming threat, of the ghost that was coming home. He received no reply. The Earth to which Kalen raced was a shadow of its former self. After the correction, it had become a backwater planet, a museum of a species' failed ambitions. Its great cities were smaller, quieter, their gleaming spires tarnished by time and neglect. Its people were survivors, pragmatic and weary, their gaze fixed on the ground rather than the stars they had been forbidden to reach. They were ruled by Governor Eva Rostova, a woman whose political career had been forged in the grim reality of managed decline. She was not a leader of vision, but of maintenance. Her primary goal was to keep the lights on, the air breathable, and the Concordance patrols satisfied. When Kalen's garbled message reached her desk, filtered through a dozen layers of bureaucracy, she saw it not as a warning, but as a threat. The story of a rogue salvager with a mythical weapon was the kind of tale that could spark riots, that could shatter the fragile peace she had spent her life preserving. Her response was swift and decisive. She classified the message, buried it under a mountain of security protocols, and issued a warrant for Kalen's arrest. He was branded a terrorist, a purveyor of dangerous propaganda, his ship a rogue vessel to be intercepted and neutralized on sight. She was trying to silence a prophet to prevent a panic, unaware that she was trying to shout down a hurricane. Prefect Valerius, now acting on his own authority in the ruins of the Xylosian government, came to a different conclusion. The Concordance was dead, but the galaxy still needed a semblance of order. He saw the pattern in the ghosts at tax finance, history, law. It was a systematic deconstruction of a civilization. The final logical target was not a planet, but a concept sovereignty. To strike at Earth, the human homeworld, was to deliver the ultimate message that no one was safe, that even the cradle of a species could become its tomb. Using the last of his authority, he requisitioned a Xylosian stealth cruiser, the Silent Vigil, and set a course for the Sol system. He did not go as a conqueror or a peacekeeper, but as an observer. He had to witness the endgame. He had to understand the motive behind this elegant, terrifying apocalypse. Was it pure nihilism, or was it the prelude to a new and unknown chapter in galactic history as Kalen's ship, the Rust Dog, hurtled through the outer Oort cloud? The data core in its containment field began to hum again. This time, there was no music, No requiem. There was only a single, pure, resonant tone that grew steadily in volume and intensity. The bulkheads of his ship groaned under the strain, the metal vibrating as if it were about to fly apart. A new image was projected onto the wall, clearer this time. It was a schematic, a complex diagram of a massive circular construct. Kalen recognized the geometry. It was a quantum resonance amplifier, but on a scale that dwarfed anything he had ever seen. It was designed to fold space-time, to create a stable, localized wormhole. And at the heart of the schematic was the symbol of the closed eye. He was not just carrying a key, he was carrying the focusing lens for a gateway. The ghost was not going to Earth to destroy it. It was going to open something. The arrival was subtle, without fanfare. One moment, the space around Earth's orbit was empty, monitored by the jittery ships of the Directorate Defense Fleet. The next, the resonance was there. It was not a ship, not a physical object that could be targeted or tracked. It was a presence, a distortion in the fabric of reality that caused sensors to scream with impossible readings and pilots to report a profound sense of vertigo. It manifested first as a shimmering in the void, a heat haze in the vacuum of space between Earth and its moon. Then, the hum began, a bass note that was felt not in the ears, but in the bones of every living thing on the planet. Governor Rostova, watching from the command center of the orbital defense platform Aegis, gave the order to fire. She would not let her world be held hostage by a phantom. A volley of plasma torpedoes and railgun slugs tore through the shimmering distortion. They did not explode. They passed through it as if it were nothing more than a trick of the light and continued on their trajectory into deep space. The ghost was intangible, untouchable. Then, it responded. The shimmering intensified, coalescing into a vast, swirling vortex of energy 100 miles in diameter. It was a maelstrom of light and color, a wound in the sky that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. From the heart of this vortex, the music began. It was a symphony this time, a powerful orchestral piece that was both tragic and triumphant. It was the sound of a century of sorrow, but also a century of unbreakable will. And as the symphony swelled, the planet began to change. On the surface of Earth, technology began to fail, but not in the way it had at the Zenith Citadel. This was not aging, it was reverting. Advanced fusion reactors sputtered and went cold, while old, forgotten fission plants in abandoned cities flickered back to life. The global data net collapsed, but ancient, buried fiber optic cables began to carry signals for the first time in a century. It was as if 100 years of technological stagnation imposed by the concordance was being peeled back, layer by layer. The ghost was not destroying Earth's present. It was reawakening its past. On board the Rust Dog, Kalen watched in awe as the data core pulsed in time with the symphony, the schematic on his wall glowing with power. He finally understood the scientist's ultimate goal. The correction hadn't just stifled humanity's expansion, it had severed their connection to their own technological trajectory. They had been forced to adopt concordance-approved systems, to abandon their own unique path of scientific discovery. The Odyssey Project, the weaponization of quantum resonance, wasn't meant to be a weapon of vengeance. It was a failsafe. It was a reset switch, a way to burn away the imposed alien technology and restore the foundations of their own. Lost science. The ghost was not a herald of apocalypse. It was an act of terraforming, not of a planet, but of a civilization. from the bridge of the silent vigil, cloaked at the edge of the system. Prefect Valerius watched the unfolding events with the dawning horror of a man realizing he has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. He had thought he was watching a war of extermination. He was wrong. He was witnessing a birth. This was not an ending. It was a schism. The ghost was severing humanity from the galactic community, not by destroying Earth, but by making it technologically incompatible. It was creating a sanctuary, a walled garden where human science could grow again, free from the stultifying influence of the concordance. But what would grow in that garden anew? More peaceful civilization, or a race of beings armed with a technology that could dismantle reality with a song? The vortex in Earth's sky began to stabilize, the swirling chaos resolving into the clear, unmistakable image of a gateway, an open door to an unknown destination. The symphony reached its crescendo, a final, soaring note of heartbreaking beauty. And then, from the surface of the planet, things began to rise, not ships, but pillars of pure, white light, ascending from a dozen locations across the globe, the ruins of old science cities, abandoned research outposts, the forgotten graves of humanity's golden age. They were arcs of information, streams of data from the past, drawn up into the gateway by the ghost's call. Kalen knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, what was happening. The data core in his ship was not just a key. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The arcs of data were incomplete. They needed the information stored within the core. The final, perfected equations from the Odyssey experiment to complete the reset. His ship was being pulled, gently but inexorably, toward the gateway. The ghost was calling its messenger home, and Kalen had a choice. He could allow the core to join with the arcs, completing the schism and isolating humanity from the galaxy forever. Or he could destroy it, shattering the gateway and leaving Earth vulnerable but connected, a wounded member of a broken galactic family. The fate of his species rested on the decision of a lone salvager, a man who had only ever wanted to be left alone, now caught between a ghost of the past and an unknowable future. The choice was a singularity, a point in time where all possible futures converged on the will of a single, tired man in a rust bucket ship. Before Kalen lay two paths, both leading to a form of oblivion. He could surrender the data core, allowing the ghost to complete its great work. Humanity would be reborn in a cradle of its own making, but it would be a cradle surrounded by an impenetrable wall, a gilded cage where they might flourish in isolation, forever severed from the greater galactic story. They would trade one form of erasure for another, becoming a myth, a ghost story told by the terrified survivors of a forgotten empire. Or he could destroy the core. He could overload his ship's reactor and turn the black, hexagonal key into a cloud of incandescent plasma. The gateway would collapse, the symphony would end, and the reset would fail. Earth would be saved from its splendid isolation, but it would be left naked and vulnerable, its past half resurrected, its future once again subject to the whims of a shattered but still dangerous galaxy. He would be trading the prison for the wilderness, a choice between a slow death and a fast one. As the rust dog was drawn ever closer to the shimmering maw of the vortex, its hull groaning a mournful protest, Kalen looked at the glowing schematic on his wall. He saw the faces of the Odyssey scientists, their expressions not of hatred, but of a desperate or parental love. They had not built a weapon of vengeance. They had forged a lifeboat. They had seen no other way to save their children from a drowning universe. But Kalen was a salvager. He had spent his life sifting through the wreckage of other people's failed dreams. He knew that nothing was ever truly lost, and that the most valuable things were often found in the spaces between broken pieces. Isolation was a kind of death. Connection, even the hostile, parasitic connection humanity had endured with the Concordance, was a form of life. To cut themselves off forever was to accept the ultimate defeat, to admit that they could not exist in the same universe as other beings. It was an act of fear, not of strength. His hands moved across his console, not towards the weapon systems or the reactor controls, but towards the interface he had jury-rigged for the containment field. The ghost wanted its final verse, the last piece of its terrible hymn. Kalen would give it to them, but he would add a chorus of his own. He opened a channel, not to broadcast, but to receive. He let the full, raw power of the data core flood his ship's systems, bypassing safety protocols and circuit breakers. The lights in his cabin exploded in a shower of sparks, and the hum became a physical presence that threatened to tear him apart atom by atom. He did not fight it. He wrapped his consciousness around it, pouring his own life, his own memories, into the data stream. He gave the ghost his childhood on a desolate asteroid, the taste of recycled air, the sight of Concordance ships passing overhead like arrogant gods. He gave it the grim satisfaction of hearing the lullaby on the pirate news feeds, the terror and awe of watching the Luminarium's memory fade. He gave it his loneliness, his stubbornness, his salvager's belief that everything, even a broken galaxy, could be repurposed. He was adding a new variable to the Odyssey scientist's grand equation himself. He was not rejecting their solution. He was amending it. On the surface of Earth, Governor Rostova watched as the symphony of the heavens changed key. The powerful orchestral swell that had seemed to signal a final, triumphant conclusion faltered. A new theme was introduced, a discordant, solitary melody that was both sorrowful and defiant. It was the song of a single ship, a single man, arguing with the choir of the dead. The melody intertwined with the grand orchestra, not fighting it, but harmonizing with it, turning a dirge of finality into an anthem of possibility. The gateway in the sky, which had begun to look like a closing iris, stabilized. The shimmering vortex did not vanish. It solidified. The chaotic maelstrom of energy coalesced into a perfect, stable ring of silver light, 1,000 miles in diameter, hanging in the space between Earth and the Moon like a new, man-made star. It was no longer a wound. It was a structure. It was no longer a weapon. It was a monument. The pillars of light ascending from the planet's surface reached the ring and were absorbed, the ancient data weaving itself into the structure's very fabric. The technological reset was complete. Across the planet, human-born science flickered back to life. A dormant giant awakened from a century of enchanted sleep. But the sky had changed. Humanity was reborn, but it would forever live under the watchful gaze of the gateway it had built. They were not prisoners. They were keepers. From the bridge of the silent vigil, Prefect Valerius watched the transformation with an emotion he could not name. It was not fear, but a profound and humbling awe. He had come expecting to witness an apocalypse and had instead seen a transfiguration. Kalen The lone salvager had not chosen isolation or submission. He had chosen sovereignty. He had taken the ghost's power and forged it not into a wall, but into a door that was currently closed, but a door that could, presumably, be opened. Valerius finally understood the full scope of what had happened. Humanity had not just seceded from the Galactic Order, it had created its own, separate reality, a pocket of space-time governed by its own unique physical laws and technological principles. And it had placed a gatekeeper at its threshold. He had a report to file with the ghost of the Concordance. It would be a simple one. Humanity was no longer a scattered, broken people. They were a unified, unpredictable, and powerful new civilization. They were not hostile, but they were no longer supplicants. The age of humanity as a galactic afterthought was over. The age of humanity as a galactic enigma had just begun. Kalen never returned. His ship, the Rust Dog, was the final piece of the offering. It was drawn into the heart of the Silver Ring, its aging hull and overworked reactor becoming one with the structure. Kalen himself, his consciousness woven into the data stream of the ghost, became something new. He was no longer a man, but a presence. He was the warden of the gateway, the conscience of the ghost. His will now eternally bound to the lock. He was the memory of a choice made, the quiet salvager who had looked at two impossible futures and had built a third out of the wreckage. The galaxy held its breath. The human question was no longer what to do with them, but what they would do with themselves. The silver ring in Earth's sky was a statement, a silent, shimmering declaration of independence. It said, "We are here. We remember what you did. We have reclaimed what you stole, and we will speak to you again. But this time, it will be on our terms." For the first time in 100 years, humanity was the master of its own story, and the rest of the galaxy could only wait and watch and wonder when, or if, they would ever decide to turn the page